Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. Do you feel overwhelmed by the hustle and bustle of city life? What is it about nature that relaxes us and improves our outlook? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Our electronic screens aren't necessarily inimical to exposure to nature, but they do tend to distract us. Many kids today would rather play video games than run around outside. Would some youngsters with ADHD do better if they spent more time at recess or playing in the park?
When I walk on the beach and hear the waves, I can feel my stress melt away. What natural exposure helps you relax?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, find out how nature can make you happier, healthier, and more creative.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, public health experts have been exhorting Americans to eat less salt and thus reduce their risk of high blood pressure. New research shows that packaged food purchased in 2014 had significantly less sodium than that in grocery bags in 2000. The scientists used data from the Nielsen HomeScan Consumer Panel. Approximately 170,000 households participated nationwide during this time, scanning every package of food they bought. The barcodes allowed the investigators to calculate how much sodium was in each food per person it was serving. They concluded that there's been a 12% decline in sodium content during this time, dropping per capita sodium by almost 400 milligrams per person per day. Nonetheless, they say, most U.S. households are still getting more sodium than experts consider healthy, and further reductions are needed.
A new kind of immunotherapy called CAR-T captured attention at the American Society of Clinical Oncology. CAR-T stands for Chimeric Antigen Receptor T-cell therapy. This approach involves removing blood from a cancer patient, modifying the DNA in the T-cells that are crucial for immunological responses, and then reinfusing them back into the patient. Initial results have been promising against blood cancers such as lymphomas and leukemias. Now, investigators have reported on 2 new studies that have used CAR-T to treat people with multiple myeloma. The studies are small, but the results are impressive. The volunteers had previously been given standard multiple myeloma treatments, but their cancers have gotten worse. After the CAR-T therapy, almost every patient responded. Many went into complete remission, and some are more than a year out of treatment with no sign of disease. One patient, however, had the cancer worsen. Side effects of the therapy include low blood pressure, fever, and difficulty breathing, but they respond to treatment. While the results are encouraging, CAR-T is still experimental. Moreover, it must be individually created for each patient, and the cost runs to hundreds of thousands of dollars as a consequence.
Independent research has shown that both olive oil and wine appear to protect people from cardiovascular disease. A new study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition suggests that's no coincidence. Both virgin olive oil and wine contain the polyphenol hydroxytyrosol. This compound is metabolized to homovanillyl alcohol, or HVAL for short. The researchers tested urine samples of 1,851 older men and women who participated in a 5-year trial of the Mediterranean diet in Spain. The investigators were specifically looking for HVAL levels. The higher the HVAL concentrations in urine, the less likely people were to develop cardiovascular disease or die prematurely. The authors predicted that older people with the highest levels of HVAL gained nearly a decade compared to people with low levels of this compound.
In recent years, researchers have become extremely interested in the microorganisms living in our digestive tracts. This microbiome has a profound impact on our overall health. Now, researchers at MD Anderson Cancer Center report that the microbiome can impact how patients respond to treatment. 105 patients with metastatic melanoma were treated with the latest immunotherapy drugs called checkpoint inhibitors. Patients with the greatest diversity of bacteria in their GI tracts had the best response and the longest survival rates. Because the microbiome can be affected by many factors, including diet, exercise, and medications, it's possible that cancer researchers will want to influence the microbiome in order to maximize the newest immunotherapy.
Sleeping a bit longer might help people with attention and reaction time. That's what scientists found in a study of 17 Major League Baseball players. First, the researchers established the players' habitual sleep time. Then they randomly assigned players to continue with their usual nighttime regimen or to sleep an extra hour every night for 5 nights. Those who slept longer were less tired, and they were 13% faster on a test of cognitive processing speed. That difference could matter in the middle of a ball game. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. How important is nature for your health and well-being? Do you like to listen to birds singing and feel a breeze on your face? Does walking in a garden improve your mood?
Today, we're talking about why nature makes us happier, healthier, and more creative. Our guest is Florence Williams. She's a journalist who has written for National Geographic and the New York Times and is a contributing editor to Outside magazine. Her most recent book is The Nature Fix.
Florence Williams, welcome back to the People's Pharmacy.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Florence, we have been reading your book, The Nature Fix. It is fascinating, and I was quite taken with the way you introduce it. In the very first chapter, before we even get into chapters, you talk about your own experience moving from Boulder, Colorado, a place I know a little bit, to Washington, D.C. Big difference. Tell us about that, please.
Yes, my own personal journey really inspired this book. And I experienced a big change, as you said, a big dramatic change in my own sort of local environment. I had lived for over 2 decades in the Rocky Mountains, either in Colorado or in Montana. And I had mountain trails right outside my door, snow-capped peaks, very dramatic kind of definition of nature. I was very nature connected. And then my husband got a job in Washington, D.C. So we moved here a few years ago. And I just instantly felt like this sort of stress bomb, went off in my brain. I never knew that I was sensitive to noise pollution, but I found myself, having trouble sleeping. I was anxious. I was really annoyed by all the urban and street noise. And I started to wonder, what the science had to say about how our environment affects our mood and our psychology and even our cognition.
What did you discover?
Well, I was fortunate I got an assignment from Outside magazine to travel to Japan to write about some research being done there, looking at the practice of forest bathing, which is also called Shinrin-yoku in Japanese. And it's this kind of eccentric practice where especially stressed out office workers are encouraged to go out into the woods, not too far from Tokyo, and spend some time hanging out in the woods. They don't have to actually take off their clothes. And they sort of engage all their senses. And so that's really the idea behind forest bathing. And there are forest rangers who specialize in forest bathing and in kind of helping people de-stress. And so what they do is they typically will have people take deep breaths, pay attention to what they're inhaling. And in the forest outside of Tokyo, there are a lot of wonderful Hinoki cypress forests, which are these evergreen trees that smell really pungent and wonderful, sort of like Christmas tree meets Vapo Rub. It's very invigorating. And then they would also, concentrate on what kinds of birds they were listening to, or the sound of the creek, fractal patterns maybe in the leaves or the rocks, sort of the moss under their feet, or even the breeze on their cheeks. And then, of course, they engage in drinking tea. Often in these forests, it's actually tea made from the bark. And so in this way, it's kind of a shortcut to relaxation. And in fact, the Japanese are measuring what happens to our bodies. And so they're documenting a drop in cortisol stress hormones and a drop in blood pressure and heart rate, increased feelings of mood and vitality. So that was really where I started with the science.
You mentioned fractal patterns, and I think that a lot of our listeners are wondering, well, what is she talking about? How do you see fractals in nature? That's a fascinating issue that you write about in your book. Could you explain that?
Yeah, I was really fascinated by that too, and I didn't really know what they were either. Technically, a fractal pattern is a pattern that repeats at scale. And I think we've probably all seen these on our screensavers on our computers, where you see this kind of mesmerizing, kind of light patterns, sprawling all over the screen and changing size. And they do kind of pull you in, and they're a little bit hypnotic on the screen. So researchers have found out that, in fact, when we look at fractal patterns, sometimes our brains release more alpha waves. Alpha waves are associated with a sort of calm, alert state, and they're really prized by surfers and poets who talk a lot about alpha waves, Buddhist monks. And it turns out that a lot of fractal patterns are also found in nature. And in fact, experiments have shown that when we view fractal patterns in nature, and we may not know they're fractal patterns, but somehow our brains process them as this kind of comfortable, appealing visual cue. And in fact, it helps us relax.
Can you give us some examples of where we might see fractal patterns in nature?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So ocean waves, there are big waves and there are small waves, but they kind of maintain the same, basic sort of geometry. Cloud patterns can be fractal. Let's see, trees and leaves, for example. So if you're looking at a leaf, you might see, a certain angle, a certain pattern in the leaf design, and that's repeated in the veins of the leaf as it gets bigger. It's even repeated in the way that the branches might meet other branches, or bigger limbs meet the tree trunk itself. And if the patterns are not too busy and also not too sort of spaced out and boring, if you hit a sweet spot of fractal dimension, then our brain is kind of in this happy place. It's pretty interesting.
Well, it sort of explains why we love looking at the ocean. I mean, when we go to the beach, the shore, just sitting and watching those waves break, it's so calming. And of course, there is the sound of the water.
And the smell.
And the smell of the salt air. I mean, it all goes to making us feel happy.
Although I think there's an interesting point here, which is that not everyone is going to feel happy looking at the ocean. So I think there's a lot of individual variability. That's something I think worth talking about. So, some people are going to look at the ocean and feel sort of freaked out, by how vast it is and how open. So if you're sort of agoraphobic, right? And other people might feel too constricted in a deep forest. So in my book, one of the things I really emphasize is that we all just need to sort of pay attention, to how we as individuals feel in a particular landscape. And it's something that we don't actually do enough. We don't pay enough attention to that.
Well, I've been fascinated to discover that there are two kinds of people, it seems. I mean, I'm sure there are all kinds of variations on this theme, but they're the people who love to go to the mountains, like you did, out in Boulder, out in the Rockies, climbing, looking at those beautiful peaks with their snow on the top. And then there are people who say, nah, I want to go to the beach. I just want to lie on the sand. I just want to soak up some of the rays and just look out at the ocean. And if you've got, a husband and wife, and one of them wants to go to the mountains and one of them wants to go to the beach, it can kind of create some interesting vacations.
It can, or even worse, if someone only likes to go to the city and someone else only likes to go to the country. I guess that's where you do therapy.
I guess, or take turns or something.
Figure it out.
Now, you have mentioned that the Japanese researchers have found that there are some measurable changes in biomarkers after relatively brief exposures to nature. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, especially the study you participated in?
Yeah, absolutely. These researchers have found marked changes in people's nervous systems. And what's fascinating to me about it, too, is that it happens just after 15 minutes. So our bodies immediately start to sort of calm down when we're in a natural environment. So I mentioned the cortisol levels, the blood pressure. There's another one called heart rate variability, and there's a frequency in our heart rate that is a measure of the sympathetic nervous system. And that's the part of our nervous system that is kind of the flight or fight part of our nervous system that really responds to stress. And a lot of us tend to live in our sympathetic nervous systems often, during our sort of daily lives because we're constantly responding to emails and pings on our phones and, demands for help one way or another, checking off our to-do list. We're under deadline. There's a little bit of an urgency often to how we sort of go about our day. And we're keyed up. So our respiration increases, our blood pressure increases. And of course, if you do this, day in, day out, year after year, the result can be, cardiovascular issues. It can put us at higher risk for stroke and many other diseases. So it's really important to kind of learn how to give our nervous systems a break and allow our parasympathetic nervous system to really cue in. And that's apparently what nature can really help us do.
And obviously, it sounds as if the Japanese have understood this for quite some time and are actually encouraging it among their workforce.
Well, the Japanese workers are among the most stressed out people on the planet. So we know that they work longer hours than anyone. We know that they have very high rates of suicide and depression. And there's even a word for falling over dead at your desk, and that's karoshi in Japanese. So I think that tells you a lot about the stress levels, especially in Tokyo, which is such a crowded, such a hyper-dense, incredibly busy, stressful environment. Although, people in Japan also love nature. So they have figured out how to bring it into their apartments, bonsai plants, Zen gardens, these sort of pocket parks, as well as beautiful large spaces. And I think one of the things being in Japan really taught me is that nature doesn't have to be a snow-covered peak. It doesn't have to be a wilderness area. We can get the same physiological response that calms our nervous systems from really smaller and kind of less spectacular doses of nature. So for me, moving to Washington, it really helped me kind of learn how to do nature better in the city.
You're listening to Florence Williams, journalist and author of The Nature Fix, Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative. We spoke with her a few years ago about her previous book, Breasts, A Natural and Unnatural History. She hosts a podcast for Audible, Breasts Unbound.
I think individual variability, it's so important. I like the mountains, but I really love the beach.
That's right. And I think each person needs to find out what suits him or her best.
After the break, we'll find out what Florence Williams did when she realized the urban environment in Washington, D.C. was having a negative effect on her well-being.
How could cities be designed differently to be better for human health?
Should doctors write prescriptions for time in nature instead of drugs for ADHD?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Redex Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1082. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the podcast from iTunes.
Today, we're talking about the health effects of exposure to natural environments. Even if you never go camping or hiking, you may like watering your plants or walking your dog. To find out about the physiological effects of nature on human beings, we're talking with Florence Williams. She's a journalist and contributing editor to Outside Magazine. Her new book is The Nature Fix: Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative.
Florence, what did you do once you realized that Washington, D.C. was affecting your body in kind of a negative way?
Well, I cried. And I also just, had to figure out how to do it better. So a lot of people here tell me that, actually, Washington has all these great parks. It's not the Rocky Mountains, but we do have more green space per capita, apparently, than a lot of other places. We have a lot of trees per capita. Now, coming from the West, I wasn't necessarily so enamored of trees and forests as a lot of people here, but I've learned, to find beauty in them. When I do walk now in the parks, which I do often, almost every day now, I go about 30 minutes a day. I often take my dog. I really make an effort to engage all those senses because I know that will help me relax. And so I will pay attention to what I'm hearing. What birds are out. I will pay attention to those fractal patterns in the trees. I will sometimes now even grab a handful of pine needles on an evergreen tree and I'll crumble them up and I'll smell them. And I do feel like I get this instant little mood hit. So I've learned how to do some of that.
Now, you've mentioned that nature is good for civilization, and there have been some urban planners who seem to have recognized that. Can you tell us a little bit about how cities might be designed, how they perhaps ought to be designed to accommodate us a little bit better?
Yeah, I was so fascinated to kind of delve into the writings of Frederick Law Olmsted, who, of course, is famous for designing Central Park in about 1850. And he really understood on a sort of fundamental level that people in cities of all different walks of life need parks. They need it to help them relieve their stress and to help sort of relieve the anxieties of social living in a crowded space. But he also had this interesting insight that, there were so many immigrant communities in cities. There are so many people from different walks of life. And they also really benefited from having a place where they could mix socially and observe each other and learn to feel more comfortable with each other. So to him, urban parks really represented an opportunity for democracy, and that there's a relationship between open green space and democratic institutions. And so that has just particular resonance, I think, right now when, a lot of public lands are threatened. And also when some people feel their democratic institutions may be threatened. It just, for me, it has special resonance to look at parks not just as places for sort of personal growth, but actually, for our sort of democratic institutions to flourish.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that people have recognized, certainly urban planners, the value of green space, of parks, of places where, that hustle and bustle of the city can fade away a little bit. And there's nothing greater than walking in Central Park in New York because it is such a gorgeous place. I'm guessing, and I'd like your feedback on this concept, that people in cities sort of recognize, as you did in D.C., that city life can be stressful, and clearly they've done that in Japan. I wonder if people in the suburbs recognize that they may be even more vulnerable than people in cities. And the reason I say that is they think they're kind of, out there in, in the green space area, so that they may have a green lawn, for example, and their neighbors have a green lawn, and they drive from their home to their school or to their office, and then they drive home again, and they never, ever actually get out in nature because they kind of think they're already there. But the suburbs are really way different than a park or the kind of nature that you spent decades living in the Rockies.
I think those are great points. The research really shows that to get the greatest benefits from green space and natural areas, it helps to actually fully immerse yourself in them. So if you're just viewing them from a car window, there are some benefits to that, and there are a number of studies suggesting that having a window view of something beautiful can be very good for both cognition and our sort of mental state. But to get the full range of benefits, we really need to engage all those senses. So to feel that breeze and to smell, the flowers, literally. And you're right. I think we've all heard that people aren't walking enough. We spend way too much time driving. And I'm particularly interested in the changing life of suburban children, because children used to play outside after school, and now they don't. There have been some really dramatic changes in how much kind of free, unsupervised play children have had, from one generation to another. Been some very profound shifts in how American children spend their time. And of course, now there's so many temptations to staying inside. There's so many computer games and video games and Snapchats and, temptations keeping children in. But also, I think there's been a really profound shift in terms of parental culture, too, and parents just no longer feeling so comfortable, letting their kids run around the neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, I really was very fortunate growing up in the country on a dirt road. And when I came home from school, it was like clockwork. I went out to play for at least an hour or two. And just across the road from me was this amazing forest. And in the middle of this forest was a pine forest. So it was sort of like a forest inside a forest. And as a child, I would go into this pine forest and lie down on the pine needles and just listen to the wind blowing in those trees. It's a very special sound, and it was the most relaxing, the most peaceful place on the planet for me as a kid. And I wonder about how many children ever get to even imagine such an experience today.
Well, that's a beautiful image that you painted, and one of the things that strikes me about it is how comfortable you felt in those woods, because that's another problem that we see in children today, especially kids who grow up in the cities, but increasingly in the suburbs, that they just don't feel comfortable in nature. And so you now have a lifelong connection of positive memories associated with forests and woods, and you have a place to go when you need that kind of comfort. But so many children no longer have that tool, to help them with their resilience and their emotional state.
One of the chapters in the Nature Fix is a description of a young boy, Zach Smith, who sounds like maybe he was diagnosed with ADHD, but really the medications didn't help that much. He was still all over the place. And by 8th grade, his parents said, "This is going nowhere." And they took him out of school and put him into a different sort of environment. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yes. Zach, like so many kids today, especially boys in the United States, was diagnosed as ADHD, put on medication. He had a really hard time functioning in a normal school environment. He was very hyperactive. He was restless. He was impulsive. And he felt bad about that and was made to feel bad about that he sort of wasn't fitting in well to the expectations of his school. He got into a lot of fights. His parents were worried that he was headed for jail. And they found out about an adventure boarding school that's based actually in North Carolina, Balsam, North Carolina. It's called SOAR. It started out as a summer camp for kids who were diagnosed with ADHD or on the autism spectrum. And they've, in the last few years, have started a accredited boarding school program. So I joined them on a rock climbing expedition that was part of their normal school year. And the way the school year works is that they spend a couple of weeks on campus, which is a very wooded campus on the sporting school. And then they go 2 weeks off campus into some sort of, wilderness kind of adventure. So, and they'll build their curriculum around that. So for the rock climbing, they were in West Virginia. They were learning about the Civil War. They were learning about geology. They were learning about natural history. But they also were fully engaged in this very active, very hands-on learning environment. And kids with ADHD actually really thrive. We know they thrive with adventure sports. They thrive in an outdoor environment where they're literally allowed to run around. They don't have any walls, so they don't have to bounce off them. They can follow their curiosity. They can use their strengths, which are interpreting multiple streams of stimulation and information. And a lot of these kids told me that when they're, on the cliff face, harnessed in and the rain is starting to come down, they are so in their happy place. They say that their mind actually becomes calm and quiet when there's sort of natural chaos around them, which I thought was really fascinating.
That is fascinating. And I have to say, you do not have to have ADHD to really get great benefit from wilderness as part of your educational experience. I myself graduated from a fabulous boarding school, Colorado Rocky Mountain School, which is a college prep high school. And every year there were 2 wilderness trips, and we'd go in groups to the Four Corners country. So Colorado Rocky Mountain School is on the western slope in the Sopris Valley, and it's a beautiful, beautiful spot. But being outside was always part of the curriculum, which is nonetheless academically challenging. So, and all of us got so much out of doing wilderness trips. It taught us how to assess what we could and what we couldn't do, and to do things that we didn't think we had the capability of doing.
That's right. And we see in Europe now there is a very strong movement to provide forest kindergartens for little kids, whose brains develop through exploration and through the kind of, interpreting of stimuli that you mentioned. They also learn all these social skills by being outside and having shared experiences together. They become good at self-regulation and emotional regulation. Their gross motor skills are developing in ways that unfortunately so many kids are not right now. So we're seeing a little bit of that movement emerge here in the United States, but there are so many obstacles to it still. Liability, being one of them. A lot of parents still aren't comfortable with the idea of letting their kids, climb trees. And I think we're kind of at a crossroads where people are really starting to wonder about this epidemic disconnection from nature and how to get it back in a way that still feels safe and comfortable.
Well, Florence, I'm wondering what parents can do who, there are dangers out there. And so, unlike my parents who said go out and play when I came home from school, there are a lot of parents who go, the world is a scary place. I feel much more comfortable having, Johnny sit in front of the television or playing with his video games in his room than I do just letting him go out and run around and, be vulnerable to danger. So what can parents do short of, sending a child off to a boarding school, which a lot of parents can't afford to do, to kind of reintegrate children with nature in ways that will be safe and affordable?
Those are great questions. We are seeing some really interesting developments. I'm happy to report that more schools are looking at integrating some environmental education, for example. There's a wonderful example in Oregon. The state of Oregon just passed Proposition 99, which mandates that state lottery funds go to provide outdoor school, which is a 1-week program for every single 5th and 6th grader in the entire state. So that is great because it ensures access for everyone, not just kids who can afford it. And it integrates it into the curriculum. So I think that you're right that parents are uncomfortable sometimes with sending their kids outside. And that's why our institutions really need to also embrace it and sort of make it normal. I also think that we're seeing more families get together and take their kids out as a group because we know that there's safety in numbers. No parent wants their kid to be out there playing alone. But when we know that there are other neighborhood families who are also out there sort of embracing this idea of, building forts or, throwing stones in the creek, that also helps normalize it. It helps make it safer. And we're also seeing this interesting movement now in even pediatricians starting to prescribe time in nature to their young patients because they're seeing that their young patients have increasing levels of depression, of anxiety, certainly of obesity. They're at risk for diabetes. These are chronic health problems, that our medical community hasn't really figured out how to make a big dent in. And some people are now turning to time in parks, time outside, as being a potential antidote for all of those chronic problems. It's really been interesting to watch.
Well, it sounds like maybe physicians should start writing prescriptions for nature, not just for kids, although that's a wonderful idea, but also for their parents and for adults in general to deal with things like anxiety and insomnia and hypertension and diabetes, because nature's good for everything.
I couldn't agree more. I do think that there are some big hurdles before we get to that point. One is that so many of the doctors themselves are not comfortable in nature. They didn't spend time in nature as a kid like you did or like I did. And so there's this, level of discomfort with it. I see this even in Girl Scout leaders. The Girl Scouts, when the Girl Scouts was founded in, I think it was 1912, the outdoors was a huge part of it. And building fires, marking trails, learning how to hike, learning about the stars. And what we've seen, I think, recently is that so many Girl Scout leaders actually aren't comfortable camping. And so the girls aren't getting out as much as they could be. And the Girl Scouts recognizes this. And I think, they are trying to figure this out by hiring professionals, to take these troops out and teach them things like rock climbing, which I think is a great trend. But I do think that, until our culture gets sort of more comfortable with the idea of nature as a health intervention, it's still going to be a while.
You're listening to Florence Williams, author of The Nature Fix, Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative.
I can't imagine not letting kids climb trees. I mean, that was like every day I'd come home and I'd climb at least one tree because that's what made me happy.
But you had to have a good climbing tree.
I had one. I think families need to do more stuff together outside, whether it's with the neighbors or whether it's with, the cousins or the uncles or the aunts.
Scout troop.
Yeah, and maybe doctors should start really thinking about prescribing nature a little more often.
That's quite an idea.
After the break, we'll find out whether there's a dose-response curve with regard to exposure to nature. Pharmacologists love dose-response curves.
Are there cultural differences in the ways people view nature?
We'll learn about a nature pyramid modeled on the famous food pyramid.
We'll find out about the Mappiness Project.
What specific changes does Florence Williams have for each of us so we can get the benefit from the nature fix?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you're enjoying this People's Pharmacy podcast, why not head over to our website? Well, you'll find a wealth of information on medications, conditions, home remedies, and ways to keep yourself healthy. You'll find it all at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel utterly soft and smooth. 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
To purchase a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1082. The number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the free podcast from iTunes or from our web store.
Today we're discussing the physiological and psychological impact of immersion in nature. Our guest is Florence Williams, author of The Nature Fix, Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative.
Florence, I'm a pharmacologist, and in pharmacology we love the concept of what we call the dose-response curve. In its most simplistic way, you might think of it as if a tiny dose of Valium makes you a little calm and relaxed, a big dose of Valium may make you feel just like really zonked out. Or a little aspirin may cause you a little stomach pain, and 10 aspirins could be really bad for your digestive tract and give you an ulcer. So the more you take, the more the effect. One way to think of the dose-response curve. You talk a little bit about what I'll call a dose-response curve in nature, and there it's all good. So tell us a little bit about 5 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour, a week, a month. How does nature affect us in almost a pharmacological dose-response way?
Yeah, that really fascinated me, too. I was really interested in, is there sort of a daily minimum requirement, for example, and what do the doses look like? And I think that this is an area where the research really still has a long way to go. And I also think that there's a lot of individual variation. So there may be times in our lives, for example, when we're particularly stressed out or when we're, suffering from grief or from trauma, when we really need a bigger hit. But in general, you're right, does seem to be a dose-response curve, that a little bit of nature can, brighten our moods a little bit and help us relax. And even a bigger immersion of nature can help us go farther. The Finnish are really studying this, Finnish researchers, and they have put people in different kinds of nature. So, for example, they've taken subjects to city parks and then taken them to kind of deeper woods areas to see if there's a difference, and then had them kind of walk or sit for different periods of time. And they have come up with what is a very specific sort of dose suggestion for general public, the general population. And I think it's quite interesting. What they've come up with is that in order to prevent depression, sort of as a basic preventative practice, that we need a minimum of 5 hours a month of time in the woods. And I think they're particularly fond of the woods because Finland is covered with woods. It's like 70 or 80% forest. The Finnish people in general are very connected to them and really enjoy being in them. But they've said if you can go 10 hours a month, that's even better. But if you can get 5 hours a month as a basic minimum, then you can really help sort of prevent depression. So that translates to about 30 or 40 minutes twice a week.
That seems doable almost, doesn't it?
It almost seems doable.
I'm wondering about the various cultures. We've talked about Japan. We've talked about Finland. Are there cultural differences in how people view nature and how they react to it?
Yes, I was very interested to see that as well because I spent some time in Asia for this book. I went to Japan, I went to South Korea, I went to Singapore, and then I spent a fair amount of time in Western Europe and the United States talking to researchers. And what I noticed was that, especially in parts of Asia and Western Europe, there's a large public health focus, particularly on mental health. And mental health disorders cause a tremendous, drain on the healthcare systems. There's a lot of worker absenteeism, for example, due to depression and anxiety and sort of, worker burnout. And so there's, I think, a big public health push to study nature and health and to sort of figure it out, also to promote green space. Whereas I felt like in the United States, a lot of the really interesting research here is more about how to enhance productivity, how to make us work harder, how to make us smarter, how to sort of make us better at our jobs. So there was this kind of just different perspective that I thought was kind of revealing.
Well, I think that is really important. I worked at the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute in the Laboratory of Neuropharmacology, and we had a lot of patients with mental illness, in particular schizophrenia. And this was a gorgeous facility. I mean, it was just so beautiful. You drive down this long entranceway, this driveway that must have gone seemingly almost a mile. And then you were on this huge nature preserve, in a sense. It was like there was a farm, but there was grass and trees. It was really, really pretty. And patients were allowed to walk around. Not all of them, not all of the time on their own recognizance, but many patients could just walk around. And it seemed like a healing space. Now we create these large multi-story hospitals where people are basically confined and never get to see nature. And it seems counterintuitive to me for people with mental illness to sort of be locked up in a building.
Well, and I think that's really true for people with any kind of illness. We know based on studies now that, for example, hospital rooms with a nature view, as opposed to a view of a brick wall, and these studies have been done, those patients recover faster from surgery. They request less pain medication. They have fewer sort of negative behavior write-ups from their nurses. There are similar studies showing these kinds of effects in prisons, that prisoners with good views or with nature video access actually have less aggressive behavior. So I think, it's the mental health hospitals are sort of one extreme example of how sort of the architecture of the hospital has really changed. But I think we're seeing this in a lot of institutions where there's just this, profound separation from a healing space.
Florence, you've written about the nature pyramid, kind of on the same concept as the food pyramid. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, that was a concept I learned about. It was really popularized by an urban planner at the University of Virginia named Timothy Beatley. And I think it's a kind of a helpful way to look at how to apportion nature or nature dose, in a way that's helpful. And so the base of the pyramid is kind of the bread and butter. It's that kind of access, that urban nature that we are surrounded by all the time, and that will just kind of keep us going. If we have the great tree and the nice bird, if we can go have our lunch in the pocket park, that can kind of keep us going for a long time and help us kind of refresh ourselves. But we also need the sort of deeper immersions into nature that we can get in the middle of the pyramid. So that's more of like the specialty meats. And that would be sort of urban parks that are bigger, and regional parks, places where we have to actually make a little bit of an effort to go to, and we can spend half a day there or spend a day there. And then at the very top of the pyramid are these more kind of special doses of what I would say really should be wilderness. The places where we can't get to very often, but maybe once a year as needed, or maybe even at a few critical times in our lives, for example, during rites of passage or when we're recovering from grief or trauma. So those are the rarer experiences, but ones that are still really fundamental to kind of our self-concept, to who we are. It's when we're in the wilderness that we're able to ask ourselves, how we fit in to the rest of the world. Who do we want to be? What are our dreams and goals? And the wilderness can really help us do that.
Florence, help me relate to let's say a young person who lives in a city. Maybe they're 22, 23. They work in a cubicle office environment. They stare at a computer screen 8, 10, 12 hours a day. And they're not particularly happy with that environment. At least I wouldn't be if I was in their situation. Can you give that person perhaps some advice, some sense of how can they get out of the trap or the treadmill?
I think there are some small things they can do to make their work environment more pleasant. We've seen from studies that even potted plants can help make you a little more focused at work and behave as a nicer person. Actually, these are some really interesting studies. There are screensavers, But of course, I am a fan of real nature, not just the ones you can see on your screens. And so I would encourage everyone to structure their day so that they can have a little bit of nature, maybe change the way they walk to work or change their commute so that they can walk on streets that have more trees, for example. We know that this can have beneficial health effects. And if they can spend a little more time exercising outside instead of just in a gym, which I think is very popular among millennials, I think that they can learn to also just pay some attention to how they feel in those different environments and hopefully recognize that they feel calmer and happier and even more creative when they're outside.
You've written about something called the Mappiness Project, which sounds like it would really appeal to millennials. What was that all about?
I love the Mappiness Project. That is an iPhone app that you can download, and it's part of a big data collection out of a university in the United Kingdom. And what it does is it will ping you at random times twice a day, and it will ask you, where are you? Are you inside? Are you outside? Or are you in a vehicle? What are you doing? And how happy do you feel? Those are sort of the basic concepts. And then it will actually even correlate sort of, where you are to a map, satellite photos, and it can figure out how close you are to green space. So it's pretty detailed and pretty granular and interesting. And so I did this for a year. I answered these questions on my phone twice a day, and I got my data. I got my graphs at the end of it, and it showed me, and this was sort of shocking, that I was actually not outside very often, not as much as I thought I was. I was only outside about 7% of my time. And this is despite the fact that I reported being much happier outside than I was inside. And it also showed me that I was least happy when I was doing chores at home or childcare.
Somehow that's not a big surprise to me.
No, not a big surprise. But, it's funny. We don't often change our habits, based on our happiness. So, why do we continue to do things maybe that make us less happy? Or how can we just, facilitate a sort of a recovery from stress by taking advantage of what this data shows, which is, hey, maybe we need to go outside a little bit more often.
Well, what I really like about this project is that it kind of forces you to assess where you are at any given moment, kind of randomly. And I think a lot of the time we just are on autopilot. As you said very early in our interview, I've got a deadline, or there's some other pressure, or I've just got to deal with certain kinds of problems. There are all of these demands on a regular basis, and we're so caught up in all of those demands, all of those projects, all of those deadlines, that we don't take a moment to sort of ask ourselves, how are we doing? How are we feeling? And what can we do to make it better?
Exactly. And that's one of my hopes with this book, is really that it will provide the evidence that if you do go outside, you will actually be more productive later when you go back to work. You'll be happier. You'll treat your family members, with more generosity and humanity, and you'll feel better.
And you'll be more creative. I think that was something that was really interesting about some of the research.
Absolutely. I know as a writer, I often solve problems, in my work by going on walks outside. That's when I actually do some of my best editing. It's when I come up with ideas. And certainly, different people will have different environments where they feel creative. But I would certainly encourage them to consider nature as one of the options.
Could you tell us, please, Florence, what are the two dominant theories explaining why our brains need nature?
Well, the two theories I talk about in the book are the attention restoration theory and then the stress reduction theory. So the attention restoration theory really posits that the reason we feel better in nature is because we're resting our frontal cortex, which is kind of the seat of our attentional network. And it's what's so overworked in our daily life. When we're checking off that to-do list, when we're responding to emails, we rarely give it a break. And being out in nature allows us to give that frontal cortex a break, to not focus on, specific tasks in front of us, but to just kind of let the birdsong and the greenery and the scenery seep in. And then because we're not fatigued cognitively, we then feel better. The stress reduction theory is very similar, but it just kind of reverses the order. So we go out into nature, our nervous system calms down first, we feel calmer, and then because of that, we're cognitively sharper when we go back in.
Are there specific changes that you would recommend for all of us to make our lives more satisfying?
Yeah, I would. And some of them are pretty simple. Just, spend more time outside. Rearrange your day a little bit, spend more time outside, go outside as often as you can, bring your kids outside. It's incredibly important. Bring your family members. And also when you're there, really make an effort to be there. Take out the earbuds. That's another message for millennials. Take out your earbuds, listen to the birds. We know that birdsong is associated with focus and relaxation.
And stop looking at your cell phone. I mean, it always amuses me when I'm watching a young person walking in a park staring at their screen.
Exactly. Try to just be present in that space. That's my advice.
That's great advice, and not just for young people. It's for all of us. Florence Williams, thank you so much for talking with us on The People's Pharmacy today.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to Florence Williams. She's a journalist who has written for National Geographic and the New York Times and is a contributing editor to Outside magazine. Her most recent book is The Nature Fix: Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski is the engineer. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Red X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1082. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our site, you can check out information on prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. Share your thoughts on today's show. We'd love to learn about your feedback.
Where do you go when you go out to nature, and how does it make you feel? We'd like to hear your story. And when you visit our website, you can also sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You can listen at your own convenience or share it with a friend. We'd certainly appreciate you rating our podcast at iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you subscribe. We'd also appreciate it if you became a friend on Facebook. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks so much for listening, and please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.
We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Nicole Byer, helping you make those rooms flyer. Today's style tip: when it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild! Like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Ooh, fierce! This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.